I did want to start, though, with a little bit more of a preface, because I think I've touched on this briefly, but never really addressed it in detail, which is the really common idea that you'll hear repeated by Catholics all the time, that there have only ever been 2 instances of papal infallibility. So I don't know if you've heard that rumor floating around, but I hear people say that frequently, that there've only ever been 2 instances of papal infallibility, namely the definition of the Immaculate Conception by Pope Pius IX and the definition of the Assumption of Our Lady by Pope Pius XII. Sometimes people will qualify that a little bit more and say there have only been 2 since about the time of the First Vatican Council, since papal infallibility was defined, although of course the Immaculate Conception was defined a few years before the First Vatican Council. But in any case, most Catholics, in my experience, have an idea that the papal infallibility is used very rarely and only a handful of times, whether that's 2 or maybe a couple more. So I want to talk about that a little bit more specifically, a little bit more in depth before going on with these cases. So it's true that popes speak infallibly only rarely. It's true that the minority of papal speech is infallible, especially in the contemporary situation we have now in the last century or so, where popes have been writing encyclical letters and generally teaching and speaking just much more frequently than they ever did in the past, to the universal church. So before the internet, before mass means of communication, popes weren't speaking to the world quite so often. Before the invention of the printing press, there was a natural kind of limitation on the length that you'd want to write a document, because you have to handwrite it out every time. So official papal teaching to the world has just spiked dramatically in the last century or so. So especially now, it's more true than ever that only the minority of papal statements would qualify as infallible. But we have to grasp like some kind of relative scale of what that proportion is. So if we said hypothetically, and this is still an exaggeration, but even if we went so far as to say like 1 time a year a pope spoke infallibly, that would add up to a couple of thousand of infallible statements in the history of the church. But once a year would still be by far the exception, where everything else the Pope said that year would not be infallible. So even to say that there have been a couple of thousand instances of infallible papal teaching, which is not what I'm claiming, but even if you took that stance, that would sound like a very large number, but in the context of things popes actually say, that would end up still being quite a small percentage of the total speech of a pope. So let's look at a couple of points to go more deeply into that. So where does that claim come from, that common opinion that you'll hear repeated, that the popes have only ever spoken infallibly twice? I've searched and searched for a source for that claim. I found one, but I don't know if it's the original source. So I'm not sure quite where this idea originated specifically, but you'll find it in the Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogue. So the Committee of Representatives of Lutherans and Roman Catholics, in their official dialogue, published a joint statement on teaching authority and infallibility in the church back in 1979. And in that document, they say specifically there are only 2 papal pronouncements generally acknowledged as having engaged papal infallibility: the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. So that's at least one place where this idea comes from, but I couldn't say with confidence that they were the first ones to put forward that claim. Maybe they were picking it up from somewhere else, but they didn't cite anybody else for that claim. The argument that they gave in support of that, in support of the claim that there were only 2, is a bit of an odd one. Their claim is that in order for the Pope to speak infallibly, he has to claim to be speaking infallibly in the definition itself. So he has to explicitly invoke his own infallibility. And that's an idea that I've heard people throw around in casual conversations as well. Whenever a question comes up, you'll hear somebody say, well, the Pope didn't invoke his infallibility, or something like that, as if the Pope has to specifically say, I hereby infallibly define, like as if he had to use the word infallibly to invoke his infallibility. The funny thing about the use of that argument in the Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogue is that even the two instances that they admit, even the definitions of the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption, you can go back and read those. In neither case does the Pope explicitly invoke his own infallibility. He just says, you know, by the authority of the Holy Apostles, we declare and define that X is a dogma. There's no mention of infallibility. So when we are, so in other words, the argument that they use to limit the instances to 2 would actually bring you to 0. I've never yet seen even one case of a Pope explicitly invoking his infallibility. So the argument that there's only 2 doesn't have any solid foundation. What we're looking for when evaluating statements of popes to judge whether they are infallible or not is whether they meet the criteria set forward by Vatican I, which is 3 things: that the Pope has to be speaking as the head of the universal church and not in any lesser capacity, that he has to be speaking about a matter of faith and morals, and not in matters of discipline or governance, and that he has to be teaching in a definitive way, which means setting forth this doctrine on faith and morals as something which must be believed by all Catholics. Must be believed. So not simply saying such and such is the case, this or that is true or false, but expressing the obligation of Catholics to hold or believe the teaching that he's setting forth. So just to give a little bit more support to this, to my basic claim here that there have been more than 2 instances of papal infallibility throughout the centuries. I'll just cite a handful of authorities for you, but the real convincing argument is to look at the individual cases and see that they do in fact meet the criteria of Vatican I. So this is a question which can't be settled apart from looking at the individual cases and then counting them up, which, as far as I know, nobody's ever attempted a really complete and exhaustive list, although that would be quite a project. So just to give you citations of authors holding that there have been certainly more than 2 anyway. I think I've mentioned before in this series that at the First Vatican Council, Bishop Gasser, in his official relatio explaining the intended sense of the definition of papal infallibility, mentions in an offhand kind of way thousands and thousands of infallible judgments have already gone forth from the Apostolic See. Now, you might think there's some hyperbole involved there, and that would be fair. So I don't think we have to take Gasser as literally claiming a number in the thousands. And even if that's what he literally claimed, that would easily be just his opinion. No, you wouldn't have to. Nobody would have to take that as an official statement of the church that we have to agree with. But if you think about, so there are various ways you can count. There are different ways that you can count infallible judgments of the Apostolic See. And so depending on how you count them, thousands and thousands might not be so far off. In fact, there might be some that might not be an exaggeration. So think of 2 things in particular. One is that some of the most definitive judgments of the popes in the Middle Ages especially would list anywhere from 40 to over 100 individual propositions and then condemn them all at once in the same document. So some instances of that: Quanta Cura, which is a famous condemnation of Jansenist teaching, has, I think, a little over 100 individual propositions which are condemned. There have been several, half a dozen or so documents like that, where if you counted Quanta Cura, for example, as one because it's one document, or you could count it as 101 because that's how many doctrines are specifically defined within that document. So if you counted all of those, if you counted just the individual propositions, like infallibly taught by the popes, you'd be getting up into the hundreds pretty quickly. I don't know if you'd get to the thousands, but the number would get a lot bigger, a lot faster. And then another thing to consider is the canonization of saints. So if, as I've argued before here, which is the general position of most Catholic theologians for the last several hundred years, going all the way back to Thomas Aquinas, if every canonization of a saint, every formal canonization of a saint by a Roman pontiff is in fact an infallible definition, well, there have been quite a lot of those. It wouldn't be hard at all. So if you include those in the count, saying there have been thousands and thousands would not be far-fetched at all. John Paul II alone canonized hundreds and hundreds. I don't remember what the total number is, but it'd be easy to get to thousands in that case. So let me give you some sources or some lists. Let me give you some lists. And again, these are not like official lists. The church herself has never infallibly declared, here's the list of all the infallible teachings. But a few lists just for a helpful starting point to get an idea of Catholic theologians who do consider this question and who take seriously the criteria from Vatican I and don't just operate on the assumption that there have only been two and really investigate the question, have given examples, kind of illustrations, although none of them are meant to be exhaustive. So working backwards in time here, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as is rather well known, in their commentary on the concluding formula of the Profession of Faith, which is from 1998. So Cardinal Ratzinger was the head of the CDF at the time. He and Bertone, Archbishop Bertone, wrote a commentary on this concluding formula of the Profession of Faith. Their commentary is official in the sense that it came from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but it doesn't have the papal approval on it, so it doesn't have any real magisterial authority. So take this as the opinion of Cardinal Ratzinger, but that's a weighty opinion by itself. So he gives, in that commentary, 6 examples. One that he mentions is Benedictus Deus from 1336, which is a definition of the immortality of the spiritual soul and its immediate recompense after death, so that the souls of the saints are already enjoying the beatific vision and not waiting until the final judgment. He mentions, of course, the Immaculate Conception, which is common knowledge. He mentions also Providentissimus Deus, an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII on the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture. They mention Apostolicae Curae from 1896, also Leo XIII, on the invalidity of Anglican orders. So gives that as an example of an ex cathedra papal judgment. Also, the Assumption of Mary, of course, number 5, and the 6th example, Evangelium Vitae, which we talked about last time on the grave immorality of murder. So there are 6 cases that Ratzinger and Bertone give. Klaus Schatz is a Jesuit theologian. He wrote a study. Let me see, what was the name of his study? I must have it here. Oh, it's a long one. Well, it's a German article, Welche bisherigen päpstliche Lehrentscheidungen sind ex cathedra, historical and theological studies. So he wrote an article in the German journal for dogmatic and Catholic theology, where he gives he's only looking for dogmatic definitions specifically. And as we've talked before, popes are infallible both in their dogmatic definitions as well as in their more broadly doctrinal definitions. So he's already narrowing the scope of his search, but even just looking for dogmatic definitions, Schatz finds 7 instances of infallible papal teaching. So he goes back to the first millennium. He starts with Pope Leo the Great's, the tome of Leo to Flavian of Constantinople, the famous tome on the doctrine of the Incarnation. He also includes the letter of Pope Agatho in the year 680 to the Emperor Constantine IV, which was related to the controversies over Christology at the, what would that have been, the 6th Ecumenical Council in 681. He mentions Benedictus Deus, same as Cardinal Ratzinger does, on the immediate recompense of the souls of the just, so that the saints don't have to wait until the final judgment for the beatific vision. He mentions Cum Occasione from 1653, which condemns 5 propositions of Jansen as heretical. He mentions Auctorem Fidei from 1794, which condemned 85 errors of the Synod of Pistoia, and 7 of those propositions were condemned specifically as heretical, which makes that a dogmatic, those 7 dogmatic definitions, which is what he was looking for. And then, of course, he also includes the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. So those are the 7 cases that Schatz considers to be instances of ex cathedra teaching. If you look back to a couple of lists from the early 20th century, so not so long after the First Vatican Council, Louis Bilot was a very prominent ecclesiologist. He gives 11 examples. So the Tome of Leo, Unam Sanctam from 1302 on the necessity of being subject to the Roman Pontiff, Benedictus Deus that we've already talked about, Exsurge Domine from 1520, which condemns the errors of Martin Luther, Cum Occasione, which we've already mentioned, condemning Jansen, Celestis Pastor from 1687, condemning the errors of Miguel de Molinos, Cum Alias, 1699, condemning the errors of Fenelon, Unigenitus Dei Filius, condemning the errors of Quesnel, Jansenist errors, Auctorem Fidei that we've already mentioned, and then the definition of the Immaculate Conception, and Quanta Cura, 1864, which is a condemnation of current errors, a condemnation of contemporary errors, kind of an early condemnation of modernism in a way, you might say, although this was before Pius X had really named modernism. So that was a list of 11, which Bilot gave before the Assumption had been defined. So you could easily round that up to 12. Edmond Dublanche, in the massive French Dictionary of Catholic Theology in the early 20th century, gives a very similar list to Bilot. He adds the letter of Pope Agatho. He's less certain than Bilot is about Quanta Cura. He's not quite so sure whether to include that one. And he also discusses, but kind of leaves open, the question of whether Pascendi from 1907, condemning the modernists, might also be infallible, and Lamentabili Sane, which is a kind of Pius X's syllabus in a way of condemnations of the errors of modernism. So those are a handful of further cases that prominent theologians have put forward as examples of papal infallibility. Sorry, I know this is kind of long, just going through some lists here, but hopefully at least sparking some interest to examine some of these cases more in detail if you're interested. One more list that I think is worth looking at is from a theologian called Silva Taruca, who Salaveri cites in his Sacrae Summae Theologiae, or Sacrae Theologiae Summa. So this is a very well-known manual of ecclesiology from shortly before the Second Vatican Council. In this book, Saliveri cites a list of 20 instances that Carlos da Silva Taruca put forward as instances of infallible papal teaching from the first millennium alone. So that's very interesting, because the older stuff, the further back in history you go, the harder it is a lot of times to really sort through this. But Silva Taruca, defended the infallibility of 20 instances of papal teaching in the first millennium alone. Saliveri in this book simply reproduces the list without engaging the arguments pro or con. So, and I'm going to do the same thing. So I'll go through these instances for you without claiming myself that they're infallible. So just to put forward you, this is a prominent theologian's claim from the first half of the 20th century, which I haven't investigated the details of all these cases, so I'm not able to have an opinion really one way or the other on a lot of these. But just to give you a sense of the number and kind of documents and statements which prominent Catholic theologians through the course of history have considered to be infallible papal teaching. So just I'll run through this relatively quickly, but the Tome of Damasus in the year 380, the Tractoria Zosimus, so the Tractate of Pope Zosimus in 418, condemning Pelagianism and defining the Catholic dogma on grace. Number 3, the definition of Celestine by the Roman Synod of 430, condemning the heresy of Nestorianism and embracing and accepting the, which Ephesus in 431 embraces and commands to be accepted. Number 4, the condemnation by Leo I of the errors of the Priscillianists in 447. Number 5, the Tome of Leo. Number 6, the condemnation by Leo I of Nestorianism and Eutychianism in his letter to the Emperor Leo in 458, so a few years after the Council of Chalcedon. Number 7, the dogmatic letter of Pope Gelasius I against mitigated monophysitism. Number 8, the profession of Christological faith of Gelasius I from the year, he doesn't have the year. Number 9, the rule of faith of Pope Hormisdas in 517. Number 10, the letter of Pope Hormisdas to the Emperor Justinian, 521. Number 11, the Christological formula of faith of Pope Agapitus. Number 12, Pope Agapitus solemnly approves the formula of faith made public by Emperor Justinian and excommunicates all those who oppose it in 536. Number 13, the Constitution on the 3 chapters of Pope Vigilius. That's an especially interesting case because there were a couple of constitutions on which didn't say the same thing. Number 14, the profession of faith of Pope Pelagius I to Childebertus, King of the Franks. Number 15, another profession of faith of Pope Pelagius sent in 591 to the patriarchs of the East. Number 17, encyclical of Pope Martin I, promulgating the decrees of the Lateran Synod in the year 649, condemning monothelitism, among other things. 18, the dogmatic letter of Pope Agatho to the Emperor Constantine in 680, so we've touched on that one already a couple of times. Number 19, the definition on the veneration of sacred images by Pope Nicholas in the Roman Synod of 863. And number 20, the formula of faith proposed by Pope Hadrian II to be signed by all the bishops in the Council of Constantinople IV in the year 870, in which Photius was condemned. So that's a long list. Those would all require more investigation and discussion and so on. But my main hope there is that you take away a sense of the scope of papal teaching, which serious Catholic theologians over the course of years have considered to be strong candidates for meeting the criteria for papal infallibility.